Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris O'Connor. I'm the president of the Nova Shore Heart and Vascular and principal investigator of the Heart Failure Collaboratory. And we're here today with Heart of the Matter, our podcast discussing various issues that have come up through the collaboratory's efforts throughout the year. And today's topic at hand with our distinguished panel is, should investigators have access to clinical trial data? And I'm pleased to be joined by distinguished panel, Dr. Robert Califf from Durham, North Carolina, Dr. Marvin Konstam from Boston, Massachusetts, Dr. Mike Bristow from Denver, Colorado, Dr. Scott Solomon from Boston, Massachusetts, and Dr. Mona Fiuzat from Arlington, Northern Virginia. Well, welcome, team. And I want to get it started by asking Scott, why is this an issue? Why is this an issue that should investigators have access to clinical trial data?
So first, thanks for having us on and doing this, Chris. And I think it's an issue that many of us have struggled with for many years. Those of us who've done clinical trials working with industry, and these aren't trials that we're doing as investigator trials only, but ones that we're doing in collaboration with industry. We often, at the end of the study, get shown data, we get shown tables, figures, but how many investigators truly have direct access to the data? And I think that it is important that investigators be able to vouch for the data when they write that paper that goes to the Lancet or the New England Journal or JAMA, and they have to say, we vouch for the integrity of the data. What does that mean? So it's become, I think, a bit of an issue because there are sponsors for whom they expect that the investigators will work with them on the data, have access to it, do statistical analyses, and so forth. And there are also companies that are much more in control of the data and provide tables and figures potentially. And maybe that's good enough. And I guess that's really the question. Do we, as academic investigators, as partners with industry, necessarily need direct access to data to be able to say and vouch for say that the data was assessed correctly and vouch for the data in the manuscripts that we write? I think we do, and I think that investigators should have access directly to data, but it's worth a discussion, and there are obviously different models. I started in this business many years ago working with Mark Pfeffer and Rob Califf on a trial called Valiant, where it really was a true industry-academic partnership, and that's the model that I thought worked incredibly well. And I wish that happened more often, but often investigators are not given direct access to data, and it's, I think, important. And we learned a few years ago that when some investigators didn't have direct access to industry supplied data, there were erroneous publications. This was during COVID, that resulted in at least one major journal, The Lancet, putting out a statement saying that in every instance where an academic investigator is working with industry, where there's an industry-academic collaboration, that at least one academic investigator has to have direct access to the data and be able to say that. I think that should be a norm, but I'm really interested to hear what everybody else thinks.
Well, Rob, you've had the most unique position to be at every angle of this question. You were the founding director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute. You've been on the sponsor side at Verily Alphabet. You've obviously the FDA commissioner 2 terms, and you've been a journal editor, the founding editor of the American Heart Journal. Well, not founding, but one of the editors with Dan Mark of the American Heart Journal. What do you say about this? Is this, you agree with Scott? You think it should go further? You think it's too far?
Well, let me start by trying to refine the question. We'll see if others agree. When you say investigators having access, let's say we're doing a 2,000 person trial involving 50 sites. I don't believe you're talking about every investigator at every site having free reign on the database to do whatever they feel like doing. You're really, I think, mostly talking about in the few cases, and I'm going to come back to this point, the few cases where there is an academic organization and coordinating center involved. And again, I use the word academic, really not necessary to mean university associated, but a group of interested clinical people that are running the trial where they have that capability. The question is, should they only get tables and output from the sponsor, or should they do their own analysis with the ability to look at the raw data? Is that the question that you're?
That's it. That's correct.
Okay. So first, I have to make a couple of quick rhetorical points. First, we always keep using the word industry to describe the medical products industry, the healthcare delivery industry, and the big behemoths like MGB that Dr. Solomon is associated with are much larger than the medical products industry. And if you don't think that they care about what's said in these publications or have a tendency to gatekeep on what questions are asked, you really ought to look at it more closely. So I sort of object to the word industry in academia, like academics are Puritan white knights who do everything right, and industry is greedy and only looking out for itself. I'd also point out that when it came to COVID, the most egregious offenses were by academics who were publishing willy-nilly ridiculous observational studies, making claims that were just completely incorrect. And I think it's like 98% of published COVID studies were SCTs, small crappy trials that really had no chance of answering the question. So the way I look at it, but let me also on the other side, let me just say this is not a new problem. And when Dr. Solomon was in junior high school, I think we were doing the Gusto trials, and I would say early in my career, the majority of trials where Duke would be the coordinating center, we were not allowed to do because the industry would not allow access to the database. And that was a requirement of the university. And so that alleviated somewhat when we got clinicaltrials.gov through and did away with the ridiculous notion that you should be allowed to do human experiments without letting anyone know publicly that you were doing them. And as predicted by the industry leaders, the opposite happened. They said this will destroy the business model. It really didn't. And so I would say since the results are going to be publicly available anyway, it shouldn't be that much of an argument. But I think what is in play is mutual distrust about the motives of each side. And I think the concerns of academia is that industry is bound in a fiduciary sense to develop their product as an asset in the case where industry funds a clinical trial. Industry is suspicious that academics become famous by causing trouble and pointing out things that, aren't so good. And so this all turns into, in my view, into a social relationship. And I would say on balance, qualified, reputable academics with a track record should have access to the database. But turning it loose to anyone who wants to look at it, I think has a number of problems associated with it.
It's a terrific points, and I want to get to a point of what about negative or neutral trials where there's no longer any interest by the sponsor. But Mike Bristow, you've been on both sides of the coin also. What's your take on this discussion?
Well, yeah, so I think there are levels, excuse me, but I think there are levels here that we need to talk about in terms of investigators. And I think we have, we're talking about multiple domains here as well in terms of responsibility or fiduciary duty. The standard investigator in a multi-center trial, I don't believe, expects or should have access to the raw database because they're probably not going to do anything with it, for one thing. On the other hand, there needs to be some fiduciary duty among the people running the trial or really driving the trial, meaning steering committee, for example, or people who are chairing sub-studies. The chairman or overall PIs of study are typically on a steering committee anyway. There may be other people, though, like sub-studies chairmen that need to have access to the raw data, or certainly could get it if they want it. And then, of course, we have the famous DSMB we've been talking about on other podcasts and meetings. They get to see the data for sure, and ensure some aspect of legitimacy to it. So I think it's not just an issue of blanket investigator. There are various people in different roles and who do, have different responsibilities and should have them. And I think another thing is that the way to deal with this is up front in the CDA or a contract that investigators have with the sponsor, what's expected of them and what they expect should be in that up front. So there's no misunderstanding at the end of the trial. So I made a bunch of generalities here that are not very useful, perhaps, but this is more complicated than just an answer to the question that was posed at the start of the podcast.
Well, I think that brings up good points. And Marv, I want you to jump in here. I think Mike brought up the issue of the DSMB. Could that be a safety net if a sponsor says, no, I don't want the investigators to have access?
Yeah, well, I've been on a lot of DSMBs, and I guess one thing I agree completely with Mike, this is pretty complicated, and there are a lot of different levels to this, and it really depends exactly what we're talking about. DSMB is an interesting example. So does the DMC, do the members of the DMC, does the chair of the DMC actually have direct access to the data files? And the answer is usually no. There's usually a statistician or a statistical group, that manages those and are therefore unblinded. And we tend to have a lot of faith in them. But I haven't been in any data monitoring committee where the chair stood up and say, I want you to transfer the data files to me. So that's sort of another level. And it brings up the issue of what do we mean by the data? And for example, does the steering committee or executive committee want to see the clinical trial report, clinical study report, the CSR that's provided to the FDA, et cetera, which is a listing of every analysis that's been done. Of course, there are a lot of analyses that haven't been done. Or are we talking about actually transferring the data? And I think, both questions are in play. And if you're going to take the actual data files, of course, the question, what are you going to do with them? And so, you have to either personally be able to manage that and analyze that from a statistical viewpoint, et cetera, or you have to be working with somebody who does. Otherwise, it's not of any value to you. I want to get one thing off the table because, the issue of what if an investigator wants the data from their site? Is that something that should be allowed? And Scott's just shaking his head, and I would shake my head vehemently as well, because really the value of this database is the aggregate nature of it, the fact that there's so many patients involved, the strength of that, and to have somebody go up and publish their own data, I think could really undermine that. So let's get that off the table. But I think that otherwise, the authors of the paper clearly need direct access to the data. And I would say that certainly the chair of the writing committee or steering committee or executive committee, should have that. And when you get, and I think the entire writing committee needs to verify that, yes, I've had access to the data and I could do with it what I want or get the analyses that I want. I may differ a little bit around the investigators out there. I certainly don't think, you can distribute the data to 500 investigators. There may be somebody who actually has the ability to analyze data and wants to have it for academic purposes or whatever. I'd be in favor of that happening, but that rules be written about what that means. Who should have access to that and who shouldn't. If somebody does that, should the original writing committee or steering committee, have a say in that paper or participate in that paper? A lot of questions that come out of that. But I think somehow or other, if somebody like that comes along at some appropriate point in time and says that, I think that we should consider access to them. So complicated questions. I spent the whole week trying to think of a reason why investigators should not get the data, and I absolutely couldn't come up with one. So I guess I'm generally in favor of it.
Chris, I wonder if this is really in many ways a preamble to a broader question. And I think, Rob, you hinted on this, which is really, what is the nature of the partnership between industry and or the broad industry, as you'd call it, and the academic academic investigators who are really working with them as partners in a particular study? And I don't mean the broad group of hundreds of investigators out there, but more what we would typically call the executive committee or a steering committee on a trial. And there's no guidance for this whatsoever. I mean, we've all done it in lots of different ways, and there are different models. And in some cases, that group has some fiduciary control. In some cases, they have no fiduciary control and are simply there as advisors. And I've seen situations where they were specifically not called a steering committee so that the company did not have to necessarily defer to them with any decisions. And in other cases, in many cases, we're asked when we publish papers, who's making that decision? And you have to be able to say, generally, it's the whole group of authors who've made that decision. I think that guidance along these lines would be enormously helpful and serve as a template for future industry academic partnerships. Our institution, probably just like Duke, will not accept a situation where a company has the rights of review. Rights of approval. They'll only accept rights of review. But I have, at least on one occasion, had to walk away from a very large project for that reason, because we couldn't come to terms with the company. They wouldn't give us publication rights or rights to review. I think this could be enforced by journals potentially, and also groups like the Heart Failure Collaboratory could potentially provide guidance for these kinds of relationships.
And I think you're right. I mean, Dr. Fiuzat, from the journal standpoint, we've seen much more instructions from the journals requiring that data transparency and access is available to the investigators as part of the data sharing agreement. Could the collaboratory take a position, put together a position statement to help standardize this across trials? What we see now is that, yes, there are best practices, like Scott says, like Rob, all the investigators here, but there is variability. And particularly when you have a negative or neutral trial, we want that data to be out there. We want people to move that data along. Often the sponsors don't want to do that anymore. And the question is, I think that social contract that you've talked about at the beginning would be valuable. But Dr. Fiuzat, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've also been on several different sides of this: industry, FDA, journal, academic. And, I agree with everything that's been said. I think there is a lot of trust between the parties that has to occur. We definitely at the journal saw investigators with access to data that was clearly not being understood correctly. And so I think that's a really big issue. I think some of these trials have a lot of nuances that need to be understood, that really the senior leaders are the only ones who really understand them. And so, for a journal editor, it does become very problematic to see papers with different results or different interpretations of data that are coming through. So I agree with everything that's been said. I think, I was thinking as you're talking, maybe one of the changes that need to be made is the question that Scott started with, which is, I know that the journals ask the lead author to take responsibility for all of the content of the paper, but maybe the person who's done the analysis should also be vouching for the portion that the other investigators can't.
Rob, give us the last word. What can the collaboratory do here to standardize this, move the field forward, reduce the variation in what we see so that we can have better transparency and greater access? I think
Very good. Unmuted there. I would sure encourage the collaboratory to put something together that represented a consensus on best practice, recognizing that for some of this, best practice just means what people think is better. There's no empirical proof of what's best. But I'd also point out, we've got to, as we go forward, there's going to be a lot to be learned. Remember that the NIH now has a policy to make the raw data available. So if an NIH-funded study, and I know Scott, Dr. Bhattacharya is Harvard's best friend right now, but in any case, he's promising to even take this a step further in terms of the transparency of clinical trials data. So that's going to provide a model where a lot of this can be tested. On the other hand, one thing I was reminded of at FDA is that 95% of clinical trials don't involve multiple sites, don't have an academic steering committee. They're run by the sponsor as a single site academic medical center trial. None of this really is pertinent to that. And so I think the question of when that structure is optimal is another thing the Heart Failure Collaboratory could opine about, because it does add complexity. But I would say that a 5,000 person clinical trial with a couple of hundred sites is by its nature complex, and complex structure I think is best suited to deal with it. On the other hand, phase 1 study or a 3-site phase 2 study just doesn't need all this stuff. So taking into account the big picture, I think it would be helpful to put forward some ideas and move the discussion along.
Well, that were terrific.
About phase 3 trials all in, so here in Chris.
Bigger trials, I think, is what Rob is saying, and multiple sites, multiple stakeholders in this. But terrific discussion, Scott. You stimulated this conversation. I think we've got some work to do in the collaboratory here, but I want to thank my colleagues here today with coming on to the Heart of the Matter podcast of the HFC, and let's see if we can push the needle forward and get trials in a better position, particularly the larger trials going forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, everybody.